The birth of a living Buddha. High in the windswept mountains of northeastern Tibet, in a small village called Takster, a child was born on July 6, 1935. The villagers could not have known that this humble infant, Lamo Thondup, would one day become the most recognized spiritual figure on earth. His family was poor, living off the rugged land. His father, Chwekyong Tsering, was a farmer and horse trader. His mother, Diki Tsering, was a gentle woman of deep faith. But destiny had already marked their son for something far greater than a rural life. According to Tibetan belief, the Dalai Lama is not born by chance, but is the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva of Compassion, Avalokiteshvara, who vows to return to earth lifetime after lifetime to aid suffering humanity. When the 13th Dalai Lama passed away in 1933, monks and oracles began the mystical search for his successor. Guided by visions seen in the sacred lake of Lamo Latso and dreams that pointed eastward, a delegation of monks embarked on a long journey across mountains and rivers until they arrived at Takster. There they met a curious little boy who recognized their belongings as his own and called them by name. After a series of spiritual tests, choosing items that had belonged to his predecessor, speaking words far beyond his years, the boy was declared the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. At the age of 2, he was taken from his village and brought to Lhasa, the spiritual capital of Tibet. His name was changed to Jetsun Jamphel Ngawang Lobsang Yeshe Tenzin Gyatso, shortened to Tenzin Gyatso, and he was enthroned as the 14th Dalai Lama in 1940. Even at such a young age, there was a serenity in his eyes that those around him would never forget. The boy who once chased chickens through the courtyard now sat upon the golden throne of Potala Palace, wearing robes that symbolized the weight of centuries. The nation of Tibet placed its hopes in him, believing he was a living Buddha destined to preserve their faith and guide them through times of turmoil that were already gathering on the horizon. The boy who became a nation's hope. The Potala Palace in Lhasa towered like a white crown over the city, its 1,000 rooms and crimson roofs glimmering in the thin, high-altitude light. For centuries, it had stood as the heart of Tibetan spirituality and government. Within its sacred halls, the young Dalai Lama began the long journey of education and enlightenment that would prepare him to guide both souls and a nation. At dawn, monks in saffron robes filled the corridors with chants that resonated through the stone walls like a heartbeat. The young Tenzin Gyatso rose each day to the sound of prayer bells and the low hum of mantras. His teachers, venerable scholars steeped in centuries-old traditions, taught him logic, philosophy, Sanskrit poetry, medicine and metaphysics. But beyond these disciplines, they taught him something deeper, the art of compassion and the discipline of the mind. As a child, the Dalai Lama was bright, curious and mischievous. He loved mechanical things and once dismantled an antique clock just to see how it worked. He was fascinated by gadgets, telescopes and even cars, rare curiosities in the secluded world of Tibet. His tutors allowed this curiosity to thrive, seeing in it not rebellion, but the natural expression of an inquisitive mind. Yet amid his studies and play, Tenzin Gyatso carried the awareness that he was more than a student or a child. He was a leader in waiting, burdened with the fate of a nation that was both spiritually rich and politically vulnerable. The Tibet of the 1940s was a land seemingly frozen in time. While the outside world was engulfed in war and revolution, Tibet remained isolated by mountains and by tradition. Its monasteries were centers of learning and devotion, but the machinery of modern governance lagged behind the times. Meanwhile, to the east, the tides of history were turning. China, fractured by civil war between nationalists and communists, was emerging from its own chaos, and both factions, despite their differences, claimed Tibet as part of China. When the young Dalai Lama was just a teenager, emissaries and rumors began to flow into Lhasa. China was changing, and its ambitions would soon reach the high plateau. Even as he continued his spiritual training, studying the scriptures and debating theology with monks twice his age, he sensed a growing unease among his elders. The independence that Tibet had enjoyed for centuries now hung by a thread. In 1950, when Tenzin Gyatso was only 15 years old, the inevitable came to pass. The newly established People's Republic of China, under Mao Zedong, launched an invasion of Tibet. The Chinese army, modern, disciplined, and enormous, swept into eastern Tibet, easily overwhelming the poorly equipped Tibetan forces. The news reached Lhasa like a distant storm. Monks and ministers looked to the Dalai Lama, still barely a boy, and realized the time for innocence was over. That same year, under immense pressure and in accordance with ancient tradition, the young Tenzin Gyatso was formally enthroned as both spiritual and political leader of Tibet, years earlier than planned. He was just 15, but he now bore the full responsibility of leading a nation caught between faith and force. In his later writings, he would recall those days with humility and heartbreak. I felt like a bird thrown into the sky, with the duty to fly, though I had never learned how. In the years that followed, the Dalai Lama sought to balance diplomacy and prayer, to protect Tibet's sovereignty without provoking total destruction. He sent delegations to Beijing, appealed to the international community, and prayed for peace. But the world was busy with its own wars and politics. Few were willing to confront Mao's China over a distant mountain kingdom. Still, the Dalai Lama refused to surrender hope. Even as soldiers gathered along Tibet's borders, he devoted his nights to meditation and his mornings to the affairs of state. Those who met him described a rare combination of calmness and courage in his eyes, a teenager, already carrying the composure of a monk and the gravity of a king. By the mid-1950s, however, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Chinese government signed the 17-point agreement, claiming to guarantee Tibet's autonomy while establishing Chinese control over its military and foreign affairs. In reality, it was the first step toward occupation. Rebellion simmered in the countryside. Monasteries were searched, monks arrested, and resentment grew. The Dalai Lama, barely in his 20s, faced an impossible dilemma: remain in Lhasa under the shadow of Chinese rule, or flee into exile and risk abandoning his people. The world was watching, but few were listening. Tibet's destiny would soon hinge on one fateful journey under the cover of darkness: the flight from Tibet. The year was 1959, and the air in Lhasa was thick with both fear and faith. Rumors whispered through the monasteries and markets alike. Chinese forces were tightening their control, and the people of Tibet were growing restless. Across the valleys, monasteries were raided, artifacts destroyed, and monks imprisoned under suspicion of disloyalty to the new order. The once serene capital trembled beneath the weight of foreign soldiers' boots. For nearly a decade, the Dalai Lama had tried to navigate an impossible balance, maintaining dialogue with Mao's government while protecting his people's faith and dignity. He had traveled to Beijing in 1954, where he met Mao himself. The meeting was outwardly cordial, filled with polite gestures and promises of liberation. But beneath the surface, the Dalai Lama sensed the cold machinery of a new ideology, one that dismissed religion as superstition and compassion as weakness. Mao famously told him, "Religion is poison." Those words would echo in Tenzin Gyatso's heart for the rest of his life. When he returned to Tibet, he found his homeland changed. Chinese troops were everywhere. Propaganda posters covered monastery walls. Traditional schools were being replaced with re-education centers. The Tibetan people, fiercely loyal to their faith, began to revolt. Guerrilla fighters took to the mountains, forming pockets of resistance against the Chinese army. Lhasa became a city on edge, a place where prayer wheels spun beside rifles. Then, in March of 1959, the situation reached its breaking point. The Chinese authorities invited the Dalai Lama to attend a cultural performance at their military headquarters, unarmed and without his bodyguards. The invitation reeked of danger. Word spread quickly through the city, and within hours, thousands of Tibetans surrounded the Norbulinka Palace, the Dalai Lama's summer residence, determined to protect their leader with their lives. They formed human shields, chanting prayers and vowing that he must not leave. For days, the standoff escalated. Chinese artillery units began to position themselves around the palace. The tension was unbearable. Inside the Norbulinka, the Dalai Lama prayed and meditated, torn between faith and fear. His advisors urged him to flee, saying the Chinese planned to capture or assassinate him. At night, he gazed through the windows toward the distant mountains, knowing that exile meant abandoning his people, yet staying meant almost certain death. On the night of March 17, 1959, disguised as a common soldier and guided by a small entourage, the Dalai Lama slipped out of the palace under cover of darkness. His departure was a secret known to only a handful of trusted followers. The group carried minimal supplies, just enough food and water to survive the treacherous journey ahead. They rode yaks and horses, navigating through snow, rocky passes, and bitter cold. Every step was filled with uncertainty. Chinese patrols scoured the land, and at any moment they could have been discovered. For 2 harrowing weeks, the Dalai Lama and his companions traveled across the Himalayas, enduring storms, hunger, and exhaustion. He later described the experience as both terrifying and transformative. In that moment of fear, I realized that my life was not my own. It belonged to the people who had placed their trust in me. At last, on March 31, 1959, the weary travelers crossed into India, where they were greeted by Indian border guards and offered asylum by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. The Dalai Lama, just 23 years old, was now a leader without a country. Behind him, Tibet was in flames. The Chinese army crushed the Lhasa uprising, killing thousands. Monasteries were looted, monks executed, and centuries of Tibetan culture were nearly erased in a single season of violence. The Dalai Lama wept when he heard the news. From his temporary refuge in Dharamshala, India, he issued a declaration to his people. "I am safe, but my heart is with you. We will continue our struggle through peace, through compassion, and through the preservation of our faith." It was a turning point, not only in his life but in the moral history of the modern world. The young man who had fled his homeland now stood as a living embodiment of endurance without hatred, of suffering transformed into strength. The Dalai Lama soon established a government in exile in Dharamshala, often called Little Lhasa, where monks, scholars, and refugees rebuilt what they could of Tibetan life. Schools were founded, scriptures preserved, and exiled families reunited. The task was monumental, to rebuild a nation's spirit without its soil. But the Dalai Lama's vision reached beyond politics. He saw in exile not just loss, but opportunity to bring the timeless wisdom of Tibet to a suffering world. He often reflected on those early years in India with gratitude. "I lost my country, but I found my voice." The Voice of Exile. When the Dalai Lama arrived in India in 1959, he was a refugee with no throne, no army, and no land to rule. Yet within that profound displacement, he discovered an extraordinary freedom, the freedom to speak to the whole world, not merely to Tibet. Dharamshala, perched in the foothills of the Himalayas, became his new home and the heart of the Tibetan diaspora. What began as a cluster of tents and wooden huts soon transformed into a thriving cultural and spiritual center, the seat of a nation without borders. Rebuilding a nation of the spirit. In the early years of exile, the Dalai Lama focused on the survival of his people. Thousands of Tibetan refugees poured into India, Nepal, and Bhutan, many sick or starving after the perilous trek across the mountains. His first task was humanitarian, to secure food, shelter, and education for the displaced. With the help of India and international relief organizations, he established settlements, schools, and monasteries to preserve the Tibetan way of life. He was deeply aware that the preservation of Tibet would not come through weapons or rebellion, but through education and cultural continuity. In 1960, he founded the Tibetan Children's Village, ensuring that even the youngest exiles would learn their language, history, and faith. "If we lose our culture," he said, "we lose ourselves." To him, exile was not the end of Tibet, but a new chapter, one written in the hearts of its people. At the same time, the Dalai Lama began to reform the structure of Tibetan governance. He introduced a democratic constitution for Tibetans in exile, a remarkable step for a leader who had once been an absolute monarch. By 1963, he had established the Central Tibetan Administration, CTA, a government in exile that balanced faith with democracy. His belief was that the authority of compassion must also include the voice of the people. In 2001, he would go even further, voluntarily stepping back from political power to allow the first directly elected Khalon Tripa, Prime Minister, to lead the exile government. It was a rare gesture of humility in the annals of global leadership. a spiritual monarch choosing democracy for the good of his people. From exile to the world stage, in the 1960s and 1970s, as the Cold War divided the world, the Dalai Lama's message began to reach beyond the borders of Tibet. Western scholars and seekers, disillusioned with materialism and drawn to mysticism, flocked to Dharamshala to study Buddhism under his guidance. He welcomed them warmly, teaching that compassion was not the property of any religion, but the birthright of humanity. In lecture halls, temples, and universities across Asia, Europe, and America, the Dalai Lama spoke with a simplicity that transcended ideology. He never sought to convert, only to awaken. His message was always the same, that the true revolution is of the heart, and the greatest weapon is kindness. By the 1980s, his voice had become a global force for peace. He traveled tirelessly, meeting with scientists, religious leaders, and politicians, not as a ruler seeking power, but as a monk seeking understanding. In 1987, he presented his 5-point peace plan before the US Congress, proposing that Tibet become a zone of peace, free of violence and ecological exploitation. His appeal was moral, not political, and it captured the imagination of millions. The Nobel Peace Prize and the moral high ground. In 1989, the Dalai Lama received the Nobel Peace Prize, a recognition that solidified his status as one of the most influential moral leaders of the 20th century. The Nobel Committee cited his consistent advocacy for non-violence in the face of oppression and his compassionate leadership amid tragedy. The award came just months after the Tiananmen Square massacre, which had shocked the world. The timing was not lost on anyone. It was a subtle yet powerful rebuke of tyranny and a celebration of spiritual courage. When he accepted the prize in Oslo, the Dalai Lama spoke not of revenge or politics, but of universal responsibility. "We must learn to live together on this small planet," he said, "as brothers and sisters." His words resonated deeply in an age weary of war. Unlike many leaders who wielded armies, his authority came from the gentleness of his heart, a living embodiment of the principle that compassion is stronger than conquest. A messenger between East and West. As the decades passed, the Dalai Lama's role evolved from that of a refugee leader to a bridge between worlds. He conversed with scientists about neuroscience and the nature of consciousness, collaborated with Christian monks and Jewish rabbis on interfaith dialogue, and wrote books that reached millions: The Art of Happiness, Ethics for the New Millennium, The Universe in a Single Atom. In these works, he sought to unite ancient wisdom with modern inquiry, arguing that spirituality and science are not enemies, but complementary quests for truth. He often said that, "My religion is simple. My religion is kindness." This simple creed became the cornerstone of his global appeal. Whether speaking to politicians or schoolchildren, he radiated humility. Reporters who met him often remarked that his laughter was as contagious as his compassion, an unforced joy that could disarm cynicism in a single moment. Through the decades, the Dalai Lama's steadfast refusal to hate his oppressors baffled some and inspired many. "Anger is a poison you drink expecting another to die," he would say. It was this unyielding mercy that transformed him from a symbol of Tibet into a teacher for the world. The world's monk, global influence and teachings. By the dawn of the 21st century, the image of the Dalai Lama had become instantly recognizable around the world. The maroon and saffron robes, the warm smile, and the twinkle of humor that seemed to follow even the gravest of topics. Yet beyond the iconography lay a profound moral force, a man who had transformed personal tragedy into a universal message of peace. The Dalai Lama was no longer simply the exiled leader of Tibet. He had become a citizen of the world, a teacher whose classroom was the planet itself. The philosophy of compassion. Central to the Dalai Lama's teachings is a simple but radical idea that the survival of humanity depends not on power, but on compassion. In Tibetan Buddhism, compassion, karuna, is not merely a feeling but an active practice, a way of perceiving others as extensions of oneself. For the Dalai Lama, this truth was both spiritual and pragmatic. "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion," he taught. "If you want to be happy, practice compassion." His approach was notably secular. He did not demand faith in Buddhist doctrine. Rather, he invited everyone, regardless of religion, to adopt compassion as a universal ethic. This openness allowed his message to reach across cultural and ideological divides. To him, compassion was the bridge that could unite science and spirituality, East and West, believer and skeptic alike. He often described compassion as an inner technology, capable of transforming anger, fear, and greed into understanding. He believed that the mind could be trained, just as one might train a muscle, to respond to life's challenges with patience and kindness. This fusion of ancient meditation techniques with modern psychology attracted the attention of neuroscientists around the world. Dialogues with science. Unlike many religious leaders, the Dalai Lama welcomed scientific inquiry. He viewed science not as a threat to faith, but as a tool for expanding it. Beginning in the 1980s, he initiated the Mind and Life Dialogues, a series of conferences bringing together Buddhist scholars and leading scientists to explore consciousness, neuroplasticity, and emotional health. These meetings led to groundbreaking discoveries about the effects of meditation on the brain. Researchers found that long-term Buddhist practitioners exhibited increased activity in areas associated with empathy and positive emotion. To the Dalai Lama, these results confirmed what Buddhist philosophy had long taught, that compassion is not a passive sentiment, but a trainable state of mind. He once remarked, "If science proves some belief of Buddhism wrong, then Buddhism will have to change." Such humility was rare among religious figures, and it endeared him to the academic world. His willingness to merge reason with faith helped redefine the boundaries of spirituality in the modern era. The Art of Happiness. In 1998, the Dalai Lama co-authored The Art of Happiness, a book that distilled his teachings into practical lessons for everyday life. It became an international bestseller and introduced millions of readers to the Buddhist perspective on joy and suffering. The book's message was disarmingly simple. Happiness is not found in wealth, status, or pleasure, but in the cultivation of inner peace and compassion. He wrote, "The purpose of our lives is to be happy." This statement, at once plain and profound, encapsulated the humanistic essence of his worldview. In a time when cynicism was fashionable and materialism rampant, his words offered a countercultural wisdom rooted in humility. Through books, lectures, and interviews, the Dalai Lama transformed complex doctrines into relatable truths. He spoke not as a guru above others, but as a fellow human being struggling with the same fears and imperfections. His laughter, light, spontaneous, and unguarded, often punctuated his talks, reminding listeners that joy, too, is a form of resistance. Interfaith dialogue and universal ethics. A cornerstone of the Dalai Lama's mission has been promoting understanding among religions. He frequently meets with Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, and Sikh leaders, emphasizing that compassion lies at the heart of all faiths. Different religions are like different medicines, he explained. Each works for certain people, but all share the goal of healing the heart. In his 1999 book, Ethics for the New Millennium, he proposed what he called a secular ethic of compassion. He argued that humanity needed a moral foundation that transcended doctrine, a shared understanding of kindness, honesty, and empathy that could unite people in a pluralistic world. This vision positioned him as a moral philosopher as much as a religious figure, capable of addressing global issues, war, poverty, inequality, from a deeply human perspective. He also spoke candidly about modern challenges such as technology, environmental destruction, and loneliness. To him, the greatest danger of the digital age was not artificial intelligence or surveillance, but emotional disconnection. "We have more information," he said, "but less communication. We have more connection, but less compassion." His antidote was timeless: to slow down, to listen, and to care. The teacher of peace. By the 2010s, the Dalai Lama's travels had taken him to over 60 countries. He addressed parliaments, universities, monasteries, and even rock concerts. Despite the glamour surrounding him, he continued to live simply, sleeping on a thin mattress, eating modest vegetarian meals, and meditating before dawn each day. He refused to be idolized, reminding his followers, "I am just a simple Buddhist monk, no more, no less." Everywhere he went, he emphasized the same themes: non-violence, compassion, and interdependence. He compared humanity to the body's organs, distinct yet inseparable. When one organ suffers, he said, the whole body suffers. In the same way, when one nation suffers, the world must feel that pain. Though politically he remained committed to seeking genuine autonomy for Tibet, rather than full independence, his advocacy was rooted in dialogue rather than division. He repeatedly extended a hand of friendship to China, even as Beijing continued to denounce him as a separatist. The irony was profound. The man the Chinese government labeled a threat was, in truth, one of the world's loudest voices for peace. Compassion as revolution. The Dalai Lama has often said that true change must begin within the heart. For him, compassion was not only a personal virtue, but a revolutionary act, one that could challenge violence, injustice, and hatred more powerfully than any army. Across the decades, his unwavering belief in non-violence reshaped how the world understood resistance. He taught that to love one's enemy was not weakness, but strength, the kind that endures when the fires of anger burn out. The power of non-violence. In the shadow of the 20th century's wars and genocides, the Dalai Lama's message echoed that of other spiritual revolutionaries, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela, each of whom wielded peace as a weapon against oppression. Yet the Dalai Lama's philosophy was unique in its depth of stillness. He did not simply call for the absence of violence, he called for the presence of compassion. Non-violence is not passivity, he explained. It is active compassion, the courage to face suffering without hatred. For Tibetans, this teaching was both a balm and a burden. Many among the younger generation in exile struggled with the reality that prayer alone could not free their homeland. Some urged more militant resistance, but the Dalai Lama remained steadfast. He reminded them that hatred, even for a just cause, poisons the soul. Our victory, he said, will come not when we defeat China, but when we defeat the anger in our own hearts. His stance inspired not only Tibetans, but activists worldwide, from peace demonstrators in Europe to civil rights leaders in America. During protests and vigils for Tibet, his image was carried beside those of Gandhi and King, symbolizing the global continuity of moral resistance. In an age of polarization, the Dalai Lama represented a form of rebellion that did not seek to destroy the enemy, but to awaken his conscience. A revolution of the heart. To the Dalai Lama, revolution did not mean upheaval. It meant transformation, a turning of the human heart toward empathy. He urged people to begin with small acts of kindness, helping a stranger, forgiving an insult, or speaking truth without cruelty. If you think you are too small to make a difference, he said with a smile, try sleeping with a mosquito. His humor masked deep wisdom. He understood that compassion, when practiced collectively, could move mountains. His philosophy gave rise to what some scholars call the ethics of interdependence, a worldview recognizing that every being's happiness is tied to the happiness of others. Environmental movements, humanitarian efforts, and mindfulness-based therapies all found inspiration in this idea. When he spoke of compassion, he spoke not in abstractions but in practical human terms. He told stories of Chinese soldiers who wept with remorse, of monks who forgave their torturers, of strangers who became friends through empathy. His own example, greeting everyone from political leaders to hotel porters with the same warmth, embodied the change he wished to see in the world. Compassion in the modern world. In an era defined by social media outrage and political division, the Dalai Lama's voice stands as a quiet counterpoint. He has warned repeatedly that anger, whether online or in politics, corrodes the ability to listen. We must learn to disagree without hatred, he insists. Dialogue is the only way forward. His teachings on mindfulness and compassion have found unexpected audiences. Corporate leaders seeking ethical business models, educators developing emotional intelligence curricula, and even scientists studying the health benefits of empathy. Universities around the world have established centers for compassion inspired by his guidance, merging psychology with moral philosophy. He often reminds listeners that compassion is not sentimental, it requires courage. It is easy to be kind to those who are kind to you, he says. True compassion is when you are kind to those who are not. In recent years, his message has increasingly focused on the environment, urging humanity to see the planet itself as a living being deserving of compassion. The Earth is our only home, he tells audiences. To care for it is not an option, it is a responsibility. His appeal merges Buddhist reverence for life with scientific awareness of climate change, bridging spiritual and ecological activism. A quiet defiance. Even as the Chinese government continues to vilify him, the Dalai Lama responds with laughter. "They call me a demon," he once said, "but I try to be a good demon." His refusal to hate his oppressors remains his most subversive act. By refusing to mirror their anger, he disarms it. By forgiving, he exposes the futility of vengeance. In this way, compassion itself becomes his revolution, one that transcends politics and borders. He often says that real peace will come not from governments, but from individuals who choose kindness over cruelty. Weapons can kill the enemy, he says, but only compassion can kill hatred. In the final analysis, the Dalai Lama's revolution is not about overthrowing systems, but about awakening humanity. His teachings remind the world that moral power, when joined with humility, can outlast empires. The future of Tibet and the Dalai Lama legacy. As the 14th Dalai Lama advanced into the twilight of his life, his message of compassion, forgiveness and peace only grew stronger. Though his body had aged, his spirit remained undiminished. For over 6 decades in exile, he had served not only as the spiritual leader of Tibet, but also as one of humanity's most eloquent voices for unity. And yet, even as he smiled before audiences across the world, the question lingered. What comes after him? The question of succession. In traditional Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama is believed to be a tulku, a reincarnated being who returns again and again to guide others toward enlightenment. When one Dalai Lama dies, a search begins for his reincarnation, guided by visions, omens, and the Council of Oracles. This sacred tradition has endured for centuries, linking each Dalai Lama in an unbroken spiritual lineage stretching back to the 15th century. But with the 14th Dalai Lama's exile and China's occupation of Tibet, the process of finding his successor has become deeply political. The Chinese government, which rejects the spiritual legitimacy of the Dalai Lama, insists that it alone will choose his reincarnation, an act that Tibetans view as both absurd and sacrilegious. In response, the Dalai Lama has declared that his next incarnation may not be born in any territory under Chinese control, and that it is possible the institution may end entirely with him. He has even suggested a democratic approach to reincarnation, one that allows the Tibetan people to decide whether the tradition should continue. If the people feel that the Dalai Lama is no longer needed, he once said, then this institution will cease. It is not about me, it is about service. These words stunned the world, for they revealed a humility rare in any religious figure. For the Dalai Lama, the title itself was never the point. The purpose was always compassion. Still, the uncertainty surrounding succession has cast a long shadow. China has already appointed its own Panchen Lama, another high-ranking spiritual figure, in an effort to control the future of Tibetan Buddhism. The real Panchen Lama, recognized by the Dalai Lama in 1995, disappeared shortly after his identification and has not been seen since. Many fear that a similar fate could await the next Dalai Lama. Yet the Dalai Lama meets these worries with calm acceptance. If my rebirth brings benefit to others, it will happen, he says. If not, there is no need. His faith in the law of karma remains unshaken. His legacy, he believes, will not depend on where he is reborn, but on how his teachings live on in the hearts of people everywhere. A legacy beyond borders. The Dalai Lama's influence now extends far beyond Tibet, or even Buddhism itself. His teachings have been integrated into psychology programs, leadership courses, and even medical research. Schools across the world teach children social-emotional learning, rooted in his concept of universal compassion. His collaborations with neuroscientists have given rise to the science of happiness, blending ancient meditation with modern data. Leaders of nations, corporations, and faiths have sought his counsel, not because of political power, but because of moral authority. When asked how he maintains hope in the face of oppression, he smiles and says simply, "Hope is a form of strength. Without it, we are already defeated. His laughter, his tears, and his humanity have left a mark on millions. From students lighting candles in Dharamshala to scientists mapping compassion in brain scans, his vision continues to ripple across the world. His presence has taught humanity that peace is not a dream of saints, it is a discipline of daily life. In a century marked by violence, his voice has been a reminder that gentleness is not weakness, and forgiveness is not surrender. As the Dalai Lama once said, "World peace begins with inner peace. Without that, no system, no government, no revolution can bring happiness." A Tibet's continuing struggle. Inside Tibet, the struggle for cultural and spiritual survival continues. Monasteries remain under heavy surveillance. Devotion to the Dalai Lama is forbidden, and even possessing his photograph can lead to imprisonment. Yet the flame of faith endures. In secret shrines and whispered prayers, his name is still invoked, his teachings still recited. Exiled Tibetans across the world continue to fight for recognition, using art, education, and diplomacy to preserve their heritage. Though their homeland remains under occupation, the Tibetan identity, rooted in compassion, resilience, and faith, has not been extinguished. It has instead become global, carried in the hearts of exiles and their children. The Dalai Lama often says that Tibet's survival will not come from political conquest, but from the endurance of its spirit. The Chinese government may control the land, he says, but they cannot control the minds of the people. In the Dalai Lama's final years. Now in his late 80s, the Dalai Lama continues to live in Dharamshala, maintaining a simple routine of meditation, study, and teaching. His days begin before sunrise with prayer and contemplation. He still meets visitors from across the world, scientists, students, and pilgrims, who come to seek not miracles but wisdom. Though frail in body, he remains sharp in humor. Once, when asked what surprises him most about humanity, he replied, "Man sacrifices his health to make money. Then he sacrifices money to recover his health. He lives as if he will never die, and dies having never truly lived." Despite the honors and accolades he has received, he insists on humility. He has refused to canonize himself as a saint or a symbol, reminding followers that he is a simple monk, nothing more. This modesty, paradoxically, is what makes him extraordinary, a legacy of light. As the years advance, and the question of succession grows more urgent, the Dalai Lama's real legacy becomes increasingly clear. It is not the institution of the Dalai Lamas, but the transformation of global consciousness. He has redefined spirituality not as dogma, but as the art of being human. He once summarized his philosophy in a few words that capture the heart of his life's work. "My true religion is kindness. My true temple is my mind. My true prayer is love." Through exile, loss, and misunderstanding, he has remained faithful to that truth. His story is a testament to the power of peace over pride, forgiveness over vengeance, and faith over fear. In the story of Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, we find not the tale of a king who lost a kingdom, but of a monk who found the world. His laughter, his patience, and his compassion have become part of humanity's collective conscience, a quiet light that refuses to be extinguished.